Yeah, James is fine.
And we are live. Today we have a very special treat. I told my friend Johnny to hook me up with the greatest secular humanist out there today. The greatest one working in the industry today. He's reading a basically what would you call it, James?
We're a
Spiritual
humanist
secular movement?
congregation. Yeah, that's how we describe ourselves. So
And where is it? It's in
it's the Ethical Society of St. Louis in St. Louis, Missouri. So if you have ever been to Middle America, we're slap dab in the middle by the Gateway Arch.
I actually have not. I know John lives somewhere around Kansas City. I grew up in New York and I live in California, and I've never been to the middle of the country at all. The closest I've got was Arizona, which isn't very close.
Not that close, but beautiful nonetheless.
Yes. So give us, this is my first time meeting you, so I don't really know your background. I'm assuming you're an atheist, and give us your background and why you're doing what you're doing. And if there's a deconversion story in there, lay it on us. Tell us the details.
Well, I hate to disappoint your listeners, but there's no dramatic deconversion story, as you can probably tell. I know they're waiting for the wailing and the gnashing of teeth and the dark night of the soul.
I said, this is a tortured atheist.
No, I don't have any of that. I grew up in London, England.
Right.
I was born in London, and I spent the first 24 years of my life there, and very few people are actively religious in the United Kingdom. It's a very, very secular country, and I grew up in a non-religious home. I would call it a broadly humanistic home with a love of learning and a passion for knowledge and science and literature and the arts.
Did you have any interest in it at all? Were you moved? Did you watch, like, maybe even on TV or anything? Any interest? Or was it just not even a part of your life, even passingly?
It was not a part of my home life. However, I did go to a very old private school in London, which was founded by Dean John Collett, who was a dean of St. Paul's Cathedral many hundreds of years ago. And so it was a school with a Christian foundation. And that means technically it was a private Christian school. That means something quite different in a UK setting than it means to many Americans. It wasn't a evangelizing school where every student had to be a Christian, or it was trying to make students into Christians, but it did mean that culturally Christian heritage was part of my school experience. And yes, I sang in the school choir. You can probably still see the halo above my head if you squint.
Yes, I can. I noticed that, actually.
It's kind of shining on me, yeah. And I sang in the Sunday services that we used to have in the school chapel. There was a chapel on the school grounds. And I did find it fascinating, I have to say. I really enjoyed not just the singing, which I've always loved, but having a space set aside for the consideration of the biggest questions of human existence. Why are we here? What are our responsibilities to each other? What's the ultimate nature of reality? And I appreciated that the chapel offered people a location where they could sit with these questions. I didn't agree with any of the answers, but I appreciated that they were asking those questions. So I have had a long interest in religious forms of life.
Right. That's actually kind of an answer that's really good, that I was in some ways not expecting. But before we go deeper, I'll just give you, my wife is half English, and I've been to her aunt and uncle live out in Sherborne in the West Country, so I've been there twice. I've spent overall about 2.5 months out in the West Country of England, and I've been to London a few times.
So you went, what did you do in London? I got thrown off by coughing.
Oh, okay. I thought the voice cut out. No, London was just tourist. I made sure we went to the Imperial War Museum. That was one place. I was there when I was a kid. And the West Country blew my mind, because I grew up right outside New York City. And London and New York City, if you're in a pub in London, you're in a bar in New York City, they're very, very, very similar. You would be hard pressed to find the difference. But you get out into like the West Country, it's totally English. It's basically the Cotswolds is where I was.
Right.
And it's like with the rolling hillsides, and it was so cool. I mean, it was just mind blowing. Totally different world out there.
It's a beautiful country. I do miss home sometimes.
So now you moved to the United States. You Tell us about what your journey. You grew up in England and then you moved. Where'd you
Yes,
go to school?
right. So I grew up in the UK. I went to college at Cambridge, where I studied a lot of things, including philosophy. And I got more involved in discussing religion there, partly because I was studying philosophy in part, but partly because I just thought it was fun to read and think about these big ideas. I've always been interested in them. And then I became a high school teacher for a couple of years. I taught English and theater. And that
Cool.
was,
Are
yeah,
you
it
an
was
actor?
cool.
Are you an
I
actor
was
too?
very much when I was in high school and college, yes. Since
Oh,
then,
that's
not so
interesting.
much, but I
I
do
was a
see.
theater major in college,
Oh,
actually.
Craig, that's so
Yeah,
cool.
yeah, yeah. My
What's your
wife actually
favorite
moved.
role you've ever done?
I was the only professional role I did. I was in a play with Julie Harris, who you may have heard the name. She's
That's
like a
cool.
and the guy who I was friends with in the play was Philip Baker Hall. He was before he became. Um, he was in this play. It's the only professional theater I'd done, and he was telling me about this movie about to come out called Hard Eight, which was, and he's talking about this genius director that he'd been working with, which was Paul Thomas Anderson, I guess is his name, the Magnolia dude.
Mm.
Like that was before he broke, and then this guy became like a known actor. When I was hanging out with him, his biggest credit was like a thing in Seinfeld. There's a famous episode of Seinfeld where he plays the library cop, and everybody knew who he was from that. But then after we moved out to California, he became kind of like a regular film actor. Like he's a headline actor at this point. So it was pretty interesting. Yeah, I did a lot of stuff. I was in an improv troupe in the city. Nothing. My wife has more credits than I did. We moved out here to become actors, and I met her in acting class.
Oh, that's lovely.
Yeah, and she has some actual. She's been in a couple of movies. She was on a couple of TV shows. She did a thing with on the Howard Stern show, and she's got some actual credits to her name that like can be looked up. But that's the most that that's. What about you? What's the story? Did you?
I did a lot of theater, particularly in high school and college. My best story about theater is probably that I was in a middle school production of Guys and Dolls with Eddie Redmayne, who played Sarah, the female lead, and I was a walk-on part. I was a nun, and I had basically no time on stage. But that was quite a few years before Eddie went on to win an Oscar for Best Actor, which, is kind of a big deal. So
Yeah,
we
totally.
actually went to Cambridge together as well. He was acting at Shakespeare's Globe Theatre while we were at Cambridge together.
Did you do acting at college at all? Did you audition for
I
plays
studied theatre. Yeah, I actually studied a very unusual triple major, and one of them was theatre. And I did tons of productions while I was there. Some really cool stuff. I went to the Edinburgh Fringe Festival with a show called An Evening with Joe, Stalin the Musical.
Oh,
and
cool.
I played Trotsky in Stalin the Musical. That was a big hit on the Edinburgh Fringe. And then after I graduated, I did think very hard about whether I wanted to take on acting as a career. But I had the sense that what I really wanted to do was help kids learn, and that this was just my feeling at the time, and I'm not sure I was right about it in retrospect, but that I really wanted to give back to my community. I had a strong sense of the privileges I had enjoyed going to this very expensive private school and one of the best universities in the world, and I really felt I had a responsibility to do something public minded, a sort of form of public service. So I joined a very new program at the time called Teach First, which is the British version of Teach for America. It's a lot of the same people involved. And I did that. I was a terrible high school teacher. I hated telling children what to do. And so I had to decide something else to do. And after finishing that program, I went back to college, which I had been good at, and did my master's and then my doctorate degree at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And that was where I got much more.
Harvard in Boston. The
yes.
Harvard.
Yes.
Okay, cool.
The Harvard.
Oh, wow. So you have a master's from Harvard. That's pretty.
I have a master's and a doctorate from Harvard.
Wow.
No, yeah.
That's pretty highbrow.
Well, it was fun. I had a great time.
My sister, my wife's sister went to Harvard. Is that right? Yeah, my wife's sister. What is she? My relative? Is she my aunt? No. What is my wife's sister?
Your sister-in-law.
Sister-in-law. Yeah, thank you. She went to Harvard too, and her dad is a surgeon on the Harvard board or something like that. So he's like a big Massachusetts family. So I know Boston pretty well. All my cousins are from that area too. So, yeah, okay. So you got your doctorate at Harvard. So
while I was there, while I was doing graduate studies, I got much more involved with organized humanism, and partly it was because I realized very quickly how deeply religious the United States is compared to the UK. And I felt quite out of place. For the first time, even in relatively secular Boston, I met someone, a fellow graduate student, who had never encountered someone who didn't believe in God. They had never met someone who didn't believe in God. And he laughed in my face when I told him that I didn't believe in God. And I was so shocked by that, because in the UK, basically no one believes in God, that it made me think more about how religion impacts American culture. And as an outsider, when you come to the States from a European country, at least for me, coming from the UK, it's really clear that particularly conservative strands of Christianity have enormous cultural and political power, unlike anything that exists in most of Europe. And that really struck me. Particularly,
but you got that sense even in Boston, even in Massachusetts.
Oh, yeah.
Because that is probably, I mean, outside of where I grew up, New York, that's probably the most secularized. It's the most left and secular part of the country.
Yes.
Except for California, where I am now.
That gives you a sense of how different it is. Exactly. Even in Boston, I got the sense pretty quickly. I mean, people prayed at everything. Like at the start of many, public events and functions, there would be a prayer, and you just never have that in England. And so I just started to get intrigued about, also I was coming out of the closet as gay and dealing with what that meant for me and my identity. And it was right in the middle of very intense political battles about the rights and equality of gay people.
Coming out as gay, but you knew you were gay for a while before that, right?
Yeah, that's a long question. Who knows?
All right.
I was still dating women when I moved to the USA, but so I was coming to that self-realization. I was coming out of the closet, and I became very involved in gay rights activism. And once you get anywhere near things like gay rights activism, it becomes extremely clear both the political and cultural power of conservative Christianity and how deeply conservative it is, how much it, in my view, obviously speaking for myself here, it warps American political culture for the worse. And it was really coming into contact with the evangelists who would come to City Hall hearings and to Massachusetts State House hearings and argue against same-sex marriage, argue in favor of conversion therapy. They're all Christian. I mean, it was every single time, almost 100% of the opposition to my equal dignity and rights was Christian opposition. You hardly ever met anyone who wasn't in some way religious, who cared at all about same-sex marriage. And that really made me feel like there was a need to build spaces where non-religious people can come together and start exerting collective political and cultural influence to pull back on that major influence of the religious right in this country.
So is that what initially got you the idea behind what you're doing now? It was more of a political sort of inspiration? Is that what you're saying?
So that got me more involved with the humanist community on campus at Harvard. And
that's an atheist community, but they call themselves the humanist community. Are they
part
of the same thing?
Atheism is a piece of the humanist worldview, but it's only one piece, right? So generally, humanists are atheists and naturalists, not exclusively, but generally. But that is the sort of the negative piece, in that what we don't believe. Much more important to humanists is the positive bit about our commitment to the equal dignity and worth of every person, and to the use of human reason and compassion to solve human problems, a sense of our own responsibility for the world we live in. And so humanism is a worldview. It's similar to a religion in the sense it's a comprehensive view on life, with a view on epistemology, on ontology, on ethics, on metaphysics, on all these big questions. And it includes a commitment to naturalism and atheism, but it goes far beyond that. I now believe that actually atheism is one of the least important parts of humanism. But I got involved in that, and there was a very strong humanist community on Harvard's campus. And at that time, they were trying to build a congregational community for humanists. And I got involved very early in that effort, and I helped build that community. And it became a successful, thriving congregational community for humanists on Harvard's campus and in the area, one of very few communities of its type. And I realized while I was doing that I enjoyed that work, and I was more passionate about it and engaged with it than much of my academic work. And that's when I knew I had to try and find some way to make that my career.
So interesting. So so it became relatively popular on campus, or it became a thing, or how did it work? It was like was it sort of like similar in form to a religious type of thing where you met on like Sunday or Wednesday or something?
It was similar, yeah. It started honestly as a series of disconnected student groups so Harvard, like any big university, has tons of different student groups, and then it has an undergraduate campus, and it has often graduate schools like the business school, law school, education school where I was studying, etc. And each of those have their own student groups. And there are a bunch of loosely connected humanist groups, just like there are a bunch of loosely connected Christian groups on all those campuses. And the idea was to provide them a hub, a space where they could come together and host gatherings together, and also reach out to the broader community of alumni and other people who lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, who didn't have anything to do with the university. And so we started off with just an office, and then we hired a slightly bigger space. We fundraised and were able to hire a bigger space. And then we got to a third space, and then we got to our final space, which was quite a big, a floor of an office building in Harvard.
So you were like a mega church of humanism, almost.
It was maybe, we probably got, at the height of it, I would say that I saw maybe 60 to 100 folks weekly coming.
Okay, so not quite a mega church.
No, we're about
almost mega church.
20 times littler than a mega church.
Right, okay.
But for what we were trying to do, starting with nothing, and
you were stoked.
It was successful. We really
some
did
sort of germ of an idea, like there's something here that I want to start committing my life towards. Is that fair to say? This is what I want to make my mission, so to speak. Or
yes.
Okay,
I felt a sense of calling. I really felt like it was what I meant.
Isn't that kind of interesting? And you would call it a sense of calling, right?
Yes, but not from above, from the side.
Right. No, I understand
it was
that.
The world.
It's so interesting that terminology,
yeah.
because that's such an implied, it has such a implied religious terminology or spiritual thing.
Yes.
So so take us to St. Louis. So this is where you got the idea, and then.
Yeah, so it was through that work at Harvard and working more broadly within the humanist movement, which is a kind of, again, loosely connected series of national and local organizations, each promoting humanism in their own way. I became a public speaker, and I went around to these different organizations, like their local conferences and national conferences, speaking about the need to build these sorts of communities to harness what's good about the congregation and make it available to everyone. And it was through that I encountered a movement called ethical culture or ethical humanism, which was founded about 145 years ago by a guy in New York City who had a similar sense that religious congregations were important in themselves for the connections they built between each other and for providing a space where people could help each other be better than they are alone.
Right.
He had this sense that the congregation was an important, powerful civic institution in its own right, but that it was held back in his mind because each religious congregation was devoted to a specific religion. And so it split everyone into different buckets depending on their metaphysical beliefs, their beliefs about God and the afterlife, etc. And he wanted to create a space where everybody could come, regardless of their religious beliefs or lack of religious beliefs. And that became the first ethical society, which was opened in Manhattan. It's still there on Central Park West. It's this humongous building right on Central Park. And he was an incredibly influential public intellectual at his time.
What's this guy's name?
Felix Adler was his name. He was the son of a very prominent New York.
Yeah, Adler is the psychiatrist, neuroscientist guy, right? Is that?
So this was a little earlier than that, because this was before there was any neuroscience. So he was very much a philosopher, and he was the son of a prominent New York rabbi, and he went to school to study philosophy and religion. He became convinced that a personal God didn't exist, but that religion, sociologically speaking, was very important for people. So he wanted to create a non-theistic religion, essentially. And that's what ethical culture became. He founded the first one in New York City, and then he traveled around the country and internationally, and ethical societies popped up where he went, and the St. Louis Society was one of the first to be founded. So the congregation I lead now, the Ethical Society of St. Louis, has been in St. Louis for 135 years or so.
Oh, that's cool. What's the size of it there? Is it?
We are. I haven't looked at our membership figures recently because I dare not, given COVID. It's been difficult to get people to join a congregation they can't actually visit in person. Right. But we hover between about 350 to 400 pledging members with a weekly attendance. And it's very difficult to tell now because we're now in person and online at the same time. But I think last Sunday we had about 150 to 200 people in total.
Now, just inform what is the form of it? So, are you kind of like a pastor of this? Like, do you go give a sermon? Let's say take COVID out of the picture, and so take us back like 2 years when it was functioning properly.
Oh, that would be nice, wouldn't it, Craig?
Yeah, totally.
Let's go back in time.
I actually haven't been to church proper since Easter. Is the only time in the last 2 years. You know,
right?
And it's like prior to that, we hadn't gone in like 2 years. So
it's very difficult. Yeah. So I'm winding the clock back. I'm imagining that I have less gray hair, fewer wrinkles, and about 40 pounds less of me, thanks to COVID. And so when we were meeting regularly in person, my role is very similar to that of clergy of any Christian congregation.
Interesting.
My full-time job is to serve the community, to speak on Sundays, to organize educational opportunities, fellowship events, to give pastoral care and counseling, to do weddings and funerals and baby namings and other ceremonies. Like I am the clergy of my congregation. That's my job. And our gatherings, what do they look like? So we meet on Sundays for an hour, Sunday morning. We have music, a different type of music each week. So instead of having an in-house band, we hire musicians from all over the St. Louis area to provide.
Oh, you actually hire musicians? Cool. Interesting.
Oh, yes. Yeah, we pay everyone. So we want to showcase human diversity and creativity and not just have the same music every week. So one week it might be a classical pianist, and the next week it might be a bluegrass band, and then the next week it might be a spoken word poet or something. There's something different every week.
But it's not participatory music necessarily. It's more you're watching a performance.
Correct. We sometimes sing together. That is not universally popular because for some of our members it's a bit too much like church.
Too reminiscent.
Yes.
So you don't do like Christmas carols and stuff like that?
Oh, we do Christmas carols.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
we're very inconsistent in our practices in that way. Like any congregation, you have your principles and then there's whatever actually happens.
Right. So, whatever actually organically develops.
Right. Exactly. So we do carols. We occasionally sing together. We do have a chorus which sings for us. And then we have opening words from a member of the community about basically anything that's on their mind that week. It's supposed to be related to our monthly theme, but that doesn't always happen.
So what would be like a monthly theme, just so I get an idea? Like,
you
put that out somewhere, right? Like on a bulletin board or something?
Oh, sure. Stuff? Yeah, we put out a calendar at the beginning of the year, which visually represents the annual theme, which is broken down into months. It's very similar to things like sermon series on a particular topic. That's kind of what it's modeled on, honestly. This is something that I really pushed for when I started serving the congregation is more of a narrative about the year, and that's when we kind of really pushed on the annual theme broken down into months. So one of my favorites was our annual theme was the emotions, and every month we would talk about a particular emotion or combined set of emotions. So we would have love, desire, anger / hatred, fear, all those different things. And each month it would be an opportunity to hear 4, sometimes 5 different takes on why that emotion is important. So I gave a talk about why anger is good, like what the good parts of anger, because we think of it often as a negative emotion, but actually it's essential. It keeps us safe and it keeps us morally attuned to things and things like that. So and we try and get different perspectives on each of the month's topics. And so that's kind of how it works. I mean, it's really very similar. I think anyone who goes to like a contemporary,
liberal contemporary church might not notice that it isn't one. Is that what you're saying?
That might. I think it would be difficult entirely not to notice, because there is no prayer, there's no shared ritual, and there is no reference to God. But in terms of the practices, I think it would be very difficult for people to tell much of a difference between many liberal Protestant congregations and
now what's the gamut of, so ethical implies that you're doing some focus on some form of ethical structure, and then also what's the gamut of the type of people who have been showing up and the participating people? Like what are there some hardcore like atheist types who are involved?
Like Scott. Hey Scott. Yeah, no,
Scott is in the chat, like honest atheist. Scott's a hardcore atheist.
Yeah, look, Scott's already put a quote. No, we do have a range of people, right? And one of the cool things about our congregation is, at least nominally, it's open to everybody who shares the fundamental ethical values that we promote, like the equal dignity and worth of every person, the ability of human beings to discern what is true through the use of our reason and our senses and our mind and all these other things. And if you sign up to the core principles, we don't ever ask what people believe about God, right? We don't ask that question. It's not a requirement. We're non-creedal. There's no creedal statement you have to sign up to become a formal member. Right. And there are believers in God, members of our congregation, strong atheists, people for whom it is not an important question whatsoever, who just don't think that's a thing they want to spend their time on. There are convinced agnostics who are passionately agnostic. There's a wide range. Now, so practically, there's a wide range.
Interesting.
Yes. I mean, obviously, if you are, for instance, Jewish, and being Jewish is very important to your sense of identity and your
out
expression.
No, you're not invited.
No, you can. Yeah, we have many Jewish members. I mean, obviously, we were born out of a particular strand of Judaism because our founder was the son of a rabbi. But there are many Jewish congregations in the city which might meet your religious needs better and more fully than we can. And that's the same with, someone for whom some understanding of Jesus is very important to their religious life. We are hardly ever going to mention Jesus. So by default, it tends to be the agnostics, the atheists, the non-believers, the non-religious who come to us.
Interesting side note, because where I grew up in New York is most of my friends were Jewish. So secular Judaism in Westchester County is like, pretty much half the kids I grew up with were secular Jews. And a lot of them didn't necessarily believe in God, but they were still taking the form of Judaism. Like they went to Hebrew school. They all got bar mitzvahed. If you asked each and every one of them whether they believed in God, half the answers would be no. But it was really, and humanism itself kind of grew out of, I don't exactly know how, but there's a big part of the origins of it in some ways. Are you similar to Unitarian? You know what Unitarian movement is? Are you similar? It sounds very similar. What are the differences?
Probably the closest cousin of an ethical society is a Unitarian Universalist congregation. And I think the best way I've come up with of describing the difference and this is just, and I have to say this because my UU friends will get really upset if I don't preface it this way. This is my perception as an outsider who has visited and participated in many things at UU churches, but I've never been a member of a Unitarian Universalist congregation. And also, each one is different. So this doesn't apply to every single Unitarian Universalist congregation. But one of my impressions of a distinct difference is that in many Unitarian Universalist congregations, they want to welcome everyone just like we do at the Ethical Society.
Right.
But their way of welcoming everyone is by incorporating into their community life a lot of different inspirations from a lot of different religions. So they might have a bit of a reading from the Islamic tradition, and then a bit of a Jewish song, and then a bit of poetry from the Bible or something like that.
Right.
Trying to put all the religions into the space so that everyone can feel welcomed in that way. And we have a different approach to religious humanism, to religious pluralism, which is to say, we're actually just going to focus on the questions of this life. We're going to keep all of that out.
So you're more secular. You're more purely secular, and you're more focused on. So your ethics is not transcendent necessarily. It's all about, how you treat your fellow human beings on this earth in the here and now, right?
Yes.
Is that correct?
The short answer to that question is yes. As a philosopher, I'll say the long answer to that question is complicated. But the short answer to that question is yes. We're focused on the here and now.
It's really interesting. Do you have any type of a germ of spiritual belief at all? Or are you just like...
What do you mean by that, Craig? What do you mean?
I'm not actually sure. I don't know. Do you have any sort of spiritual... I don't know. You tell me. Like, where do you're an atheist, but some atheists are more iffy and more like, maybe there's some type of spiritual being, like entity that would be vague. And some atheists are more like, there's no evidence, God evidence. There's no evidence for God.
So I guess a bit of both. I mean, I certainly, when people describe spirituality to me, what they mean by it, I have those experiences and feelings. I am not someone, I actually quite like religion. People sometimes tell me that I'm the most religious atheist they've ever met, in the sense that I like to get swept away in group experiences. I could chant the Hare Krishna, for instance, all night, and I have done. When I was in Boston, I used to go to Sacred Harp singing sometimes because I really love singing and chanting and all that stuff. I think that people, when they have what they call spiritual or religious experiences, are having real experiences, meaning that something is going on psychologically there that can be of profound value. And I have had experiences like that where they match what people call transcendent experiences or experiences of the numinous or something like that. But I interpret all that naturalistically. I just think that's something that human bodies and human brains, the human organism sometimes does. I think that when people experience the presence of God, as they might describe it, basically their brain is doing backflips, and it's not a false experience in the sense that their description of what they're experiencing is really something that they are undergoing. But it's the interpretation of those experiences as pointing to some further reality outside of or above us, which I just don't share that interpretation. And I was very interested in college and in graduate school. I did a number of papers on this, in religious experience and transcendent experience. And there are a lot of humanistic psychologists who have written extensively about the nature of those experiences from a naturalistic perspective. And I'm really heartened that modern science is getting better and better at pinpointing exactly what's going on in our brains when we have experiences like that. So, for instance, through a technique called transcranial magnetic stimulation, you can now trigger ecstatic experiences in people very reliably. We can find the part of the brain which triggers them. You bring a big magnet and put it next to their skull. That's the transcranial bit, and you send basically electromagnetic waves through the skull, and you turn on and off that part of the brain, and you'll give people religious experiences. And that seems to me to suggest, yes, these are real experiences that human beings can have, but no, they're not, communications with the divine. They're just part of the exquisite majesty of being human. And my humanism is really centered around connecting people with how remarkable it is to be a human being in this natural world. And what I sometimes frustrates me is the sense I get that people don't think that the world can be magical and mysterious and overwhelming and marvelous unless you believe in something else on top of it. I think this is enough. This experience we're having right now is enough to be called something like spiritual, or even if we really get into it, it could be maybe transcendent. And that's kind of how I would explain my relationship to spirituality. I've struck you dumb.
Craig, are you there? Oh dear.
No, it's okay. I thought I had stunned him so profoundly with my wisdom that he had literally just had a spiritual reverie like the one I was describing. He was just...
I think that might have been it, yeah.
Do you think perhaps his wife came home and he's been banished to the car?
I'm suspecting that might be the case. Yeah.
He told us this is possible. I like his dedication to his craft. He's going to continue. He's going to continue in the cold vehicle. I imagine him sitting out there, shivering, hunched over the microphone.
Exactly. Yeah, that's why. Yeah, that's what he does whenever he needs to. He'll just run out the door, get back into the car. So anyway, okay. I'll have a question then. So, what sorts of I don't know. You say it's sort of similar to a sort of religious liturgy. What sort of readings would you maybe do, if you do any readings at all?
Can you hear me now?
There
yes,
you are. Hey,
welcome back, Craig. You're back from your transcendent experience. You've returned to us. So I'm just going to answer John's question quickly, since he was so polite to ask it. Readings. I am sometimes called upon in my role as clergy. So obviously, like many clergy, I'm a public representative of my tradition. Mm-hmm. And I take that role very seriously. It's actually one of my favorite things to do, partly because there are so few of us. There are hardly any humanist clergy, like professional humanist clergy, anywhere in the world. And our congregation, the Ethical Society of St. Louis, is one of the largest humanist congregations anywhere on the planet. And so I feel like as leader of the congregation, I have a major responsibility to represent the tradition well, just like any Catholic priest, when they are doing a public function as a priest, they stand for the tradition in some way. Well, so do I. And so I'm sometimes called upon to do things like readings and invocations, occasionally, to my amusement, to lead groups in prayer. And that leads to an interesting discussion. I very often turn to Carl Sagan. So that's one person whose writings and approach to the world encapsulate my sense of what it is to be human. Here we are, floating in this tiny, tiny rock in the vastness, the unimaginable vastness of space. And as far as we know, out there in all that vastness, there is no life but us. We're this tiny oasis of life in an unimaginably huge universe. And that puts our lives in incredible perspective, at least for me. It makes me feel an awesome responsibility to live well. And so I often go back to Sagan, who articulated that responsibility so effectively for things like readings. I'm a bit of a Sagan fanboy.
That's a great pick, though. Yeah, Sagan is definitely very poetic in how he writes. And also he's able to sort of evoke that feeling of awe and curiosity at just like the majesty of the universe. It's really, his book Cosmos is a great read for anyone. And it's got like great pictures too. So
stunning.
Yeah, they're beautiful.
And another thing I like about him that I try and do in my own work is he is a it goes back to Craig's earlier question. Carl Sagan was nobody's fool, and he was very critical of pseudoscience and things that he didn't believe were true.
Mm-hmm.
And he was certainly not a religious believer, and he was very clear about it, at least in terms of being a believer in God. But he did not belittle people for their beliefs. He wasn't unnecessarily antagonistic towards people because they disagreed with him. If you look at the contrast between someone like a Carl Sagan and how he related to the phenomenon of religion in the world, with this sort of openness and curiosity. He once gave a series of wonderful lectures that became a book called The Varieties of Scientific Experience, mirroring William James's earlier book, The Varieties of Religious Experience. And he kind of drew parallels between science and religion in a very open and generous way. If you mirror that with someone like a Sam Harris, who often comes across as quite scornful and belittling of people he doesn't agree with, it's a totally different attitude to their fellow human beings. And I really try and embody the Carl Sagan attitude as much as I can. I don't have a turtleneck like his amazing turtlenecks, but I do intend to get one. I would really like to have a Carl Sagan turtleneck.
Can you say billions and billions for us?
Billions and billions.
Very good.
Oh, it's so wonderful. Every time I think about that, I just think about, it's so sad that he died. I mean, my goodness, He's too young.
But you're very right. I think Carl Sagan does manage to have a sort of inviting nature to his books and his writings that where I don't know. I feel like it's just a sort of public speaking 101 where if you're trying to bring more people into the fold, mocking them and deriding them and things like that is probably not a good route. But I
agree. It doesn't work.
Yeah, the Sagan route of bringing forward the sort of majesty of this world that can.
And something else he understood that many contemporary champions of atheism particularly don't seem to understand is that you reach people with emotions and with stories more than you reach them with arguments. His best contributions to humanism, in my view, were actually his cultural works, his book Contact and the film that came out of it, which is one of my favorite movies of all time. I love that film. And it expresses his ideas so elegantly in the form of these characters. And obviously that's how religion has always conveyed its ideas. Religion is a narrative medium. It's all parables and stories about people. It's not primarily philosophical. It's primarily narrative driven. And Sagan understood that. And I hope that we capture a little bit of that at the Ethical Society, where I'm always trying to tell people stories to engage them in the bigger ideas.
Right. So you tell stories on the when you're doing your sermonettes or sermons, you model it somewhat after. Yeah, but the best preachers are all storytellers, and those stories, correspond to something that people think in their actual life. Those stories resonate with them for reasons other than, So the model that you're adopting is very similar. Is that what you're saying?
I try. I wouldn't say, I'm one of the best preachers, but I certainly believe you when you say that the best ones are the storytellers. I mean, Jesus was a storyteller. He was constantly telling stories. And the reason why we remember what he said is probably because he said it in the mode of narrative. And that there's a beautiful book by Jonathan Gottschall called The Storytelling Animal. And it's about how human beings, for whatever evolutionary reasons, are hardwired to accept information in the form of narrative more than anything else, that we intuitively gravitate towards that way of sharing information. And I think there's a deep truth in that. And too many humanists and atheists don't understand that if you want to succeed in the culture, you have to tell beautiful stories. Some Christian apologists call it being winsome. And particularly Catholic apologists, they say it's winsome. They say C.S. Lewis is winsome. And I love that word. And I think that that's another model, C.S. Lewis, of someone who knew the power of stories to convey ideas.
Right. Well, it goes all the way back to the when we were in the tribe, you had the shaman who was the storyteller, and you would perform a ritual, enact rituals, and then you would tell a story, and that story would translate some sort of, you could call it, you might call it spiritual significance too, but some sort of ethical or spiritual significance to the entire tribe. So like you would notice that like your tribe is getting too lazy, and so you'd tell a parable about how, you know, the lazy tribe lost all their food, and there'd be like an ethical point, a moral of the story. So that's part of where that tradition comes from. It's innate in some ways, or primal.
It's incredibly ancient, and some of the oldest texts that we have, written texts, some of the oldest pieces of human culture we have are essentially stories. And
right.
I think that show, we've been telling stories as a species for a very, very, very long time. And I certainly believe when I'm speaking to my community, I try to root every one of my talks in a story, either a story from my own life or a story from an exemplar figure, someone who really demonstrates the values that I'm trying to convey, or story from popular culture. Sometimes I talk way too much about Star Trek. My people complain about that too much, but
Star Trek.
Yeah,
it's like what they call the moral of the story. Even on Star Trek, the original Star Treks, that was like each episode would have like some sort of transcendent point, like, you know, the trouble with truffles, and it was actually rooted in humanist philosophy.
Yes,
it
was
people have
explicitly so. Yeah, no,
yeah.
I mean, Gene Roddenberry was a humanist, and he explicitly designed the show to convey humanist values in the form of parables. I have a whole talk about that. I talk about Star Trek as secular scripture.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah,
totally. And there was even one where they turned Christian. I don't know if you've seen that one, where they went on a planet who was worshiping, quote unquote, the sun, and they thought it was a sun god, and then at the end they find out that they were worshiping Jesus, that they were like the son of God. It was really weird. It was really hilarious. I remember that from way back when
there are some really weird episodes of the original series. So strange.
Well, the original series was brilliant. I used to watch that when I was like 15, 16 years old. I'd come home over that summer. I was working, and I'd come home every night, and like 12 to 1, I'd watch Star Trek before I went to bed. So I've seen every one of the original episodes. I haven't seen any of the offshoots or the remakes. Are you into those as well?
I am afraid to say that I have seen every single episode of every Star Trek series ever, at least once.
Wow, including the movies.
Of course the movies. Are you kidding? Yeah, and the animated series, the original one, and Lower Decks, a new animated series. I was raised on Star Trek. I sometimes say I was raised on Shakespeare, Sagan, and Star Trek, and I think that's probably Star Trek is more responsible for my humanistic outlook on life than anything else.
Well, the original Star Trek, are you a big fan of that one? The William Shatner, the one, that's the only one that I really know, except for the J.J. Abrams movies. The J.J. Abrams movies I like a lot, actually. I think they're fun.
Yeah, I think they're okay. They're fun. Yeah.
But the original Star Trek, right. They did away with them. They turned them into like popcorn entertainment. And they did away with like the original Star Trek. You're a big fan of that particular, because
my favorite was the Next Generation. Like, that's where Gene Roddenberry felt his real ambition for the series was realized, where he was able to most closely do what he wanted to do with Jean-Luc Picard,
and that's where he
Data
most put that humanist type of ethical. So I mean, your ethical structure is very closely related to spirituality in a lot of ways. I wouldn't say it's that too much different from like a Christianity light, just like without the metaphysical commitments. Is that fair to say, or would you say the same thing?
Say the question again.
It's not that different from like a Christianity light. It's sort of spiritual in a vague way. Because I always considered that show sort of spiritual. What you're calling humanist, I always thought of as like, you know, it's putting a moral in that's sort of about being better people, or whatever classical liberalism, what we used to call that, very related to Christianity in a lot of ways. I think it is.
Right. So that's that. So there, I don't think I would put it quite like that. And I actually think I put it the opposite way, in that, in my view, all religions, including Christianity, but also all the other ones, are themselves attempts by human beings to grapple with the big questions that we face as natural organisms.
I would definitely agree with that.
Right. And that in that sense, Star Trek is also a way, by human beings attempting to create narratives that are trying to grapple with the big questions of human existence. And that by stripping away the metaphysical overlay that many traditional religions have put on top of those questions, the stuff about God and the supernatural, you're actually getting closer to the core of true religion.
I was just going to say the core of what it's really all about.
Yeah, but so I don't think of it as Christianity light. In a sense, I think of Christianity as humanism light. I don't mean that in a
you're not saying
dismissive way. I'm just trying to reframe the conversation, because very often people think of humanism as basically just, you sometimes hear this argument, it's basically just the good bits of Christianity, or what people consider the good bits, the bits they like about Christianity, and borrowing or stealing that, and then none of the inconvenient bits about Jesus and the resurrection, all that stuff. And I think, no, I suspect that the bits about Jesus's divinity and stuff like that are actually the bits that are getting away from the core of his teachings, and that actually Jesus the humanist is closer to what we should be worshiping there, if we worship anything, than that other stuff.
You would see the Bible as a working out of people's highest ethical considerations, and I would call that spiritual. You might not, but I see that as this. But highest out of most important things of what it means to be a human being. But the actual codified doctrinal religious stuff isn't necessarily the right conclusion that it came to. But in that sense, all religions are batting around in the same territory. I'm not saying it very well, but I think
I think that's right. I think that's basically what I think about a religion like Christianity. I mean, I think that if you look at the actual teachings, so I'm not making any statement about the historicity of any of it or anything like that.
Right.
I'm actually radically uninterested in that question. But if you look at the teachings of someone like a Jesus, I think you see basically human-centered, community-centered teachings about how we should live this life that are given some sort of spiritual framing, but what Jesus actually did and what he taught was about how we should treat each other on this earth.
But you would agree, if I were to say, I'm not saying this is the core message, but if I were to say that the core message is some form of self-sacrificial love for the betterment of either your immediate family or the community at large, that sort of core ethical value you would probably agree with. Yes.
Well, so that's a really interesting question. I am skeptical of. I'm not saying that I necessarily agree with everything that these traditions of the answers these traditions have come up with. I think they're grappling with deep human questions. I do think actually probably the biggest problem I have with what I understand to be, maybe that's an overstatement. My philosopher mode is kicking in here, so I'm trying to be careful.
I can tell.
What I say.
That's why I'm baiting you into.
No, good. This is good. You should push. I think that I am skeptical actually about the idea of self-sacrifice as a moral ideal. I actually gave a talk to my community on Easter Sunday, rather puckishly, once about why martyrdom is not ethical. That is not actually to have the idea that you're so convinced in the rightness of your own ideas that you should die for them is probably inappropriate, actually.
Right.
You should try to be more skeptical of your own moral views than that. And that was another example where I used a story.
I meant it more in terms of like a mother and child, though. I didn't mean it as like laying. I meant it more like a mother lays down her life for her child, in the sense of like she's working to help grow and fulfill that person's destiny, as well as her own. In some ways, that person's life is more important to her, oftentimes, than her own. That's what I meant, like self-sacrificing
Right.
in that way, not necessarily martyrdom and like pouring yourself into other human beings. I think you would agree that that's a correct ethic to some degree, right? If I'm not saying it the way you phrase it, rephrase it, and I think we're sort of saying the same things.
Yes, there's something similar there. There's a kernel there. So the founder of the first ethical study, Felix Adler, who we talked about a little while ago, he had what he called the supreme ethical maxim. He didn't think the golden rule was good enough, so he came up with his own supreme ethical maxim, which is act so as to elicit the best in others and thereby in thyself. And I think that there is an element of what you call pouring yourself into humanity. I think you said that. I think that's a beautiful phrase.
That's exactly
right.
It.
You act in such a way that act so as to elicit the best in others, bring out the best in others, and thereby in thyself. So what he means is that in the process of acting to bring out the best qualities in other human beings, you are being the best version of yourself as well, right? So that it becomes so he had this radical social ideal, and that's why he thought congregations were important. You couldn't do this alone, right? He really felt that ethics is a communal enterprise, and you had to be in relationship with other people, and our job was to seek out the best qualities in other people, and the person we are when we are seeking out the best qualities in other people is the best of ourselves as well. Right. And that everyone should do that for each other. And it's actually I think it's a very good maxim. I have to say, it's very active. It requires a lot of you because you are actively responsible for trying to find the best in other people. And it's very difficult. You can ask difficult questions like, how do you elicit the best in people whose politics you hate? Right? That's a challenging question, particularly right now.
Right, but the way you frame, you might disagree with this, but the way you frame that, I would call deeply Christian in the best sense of the term. Like you probably wouldn't, but I as a Christian would. That's the core ethical teaching of Jesus Christ to some degrees.
I think that's great. I mean, Adler certainly felt like there was I'm not sure I agree with him about this, but he felt like there was an ethical core at the heart of all religions, and it was basically about something like our commitment to the betterment of others. And he found that in Christianity, in Judaism. He was actually a scholar of many world religions. He spoke, I think, 7 languages. He was a ludicrous overachiever. And he read, all the great religious texts in their original languages, pretty much. And he thought that they all had a similar religious ideal. I don't necessarily go that far. I mean, I tend to think of religions as kind of grab bags of really great insights and interesting ideas and some really bad ideas as well. And the bad ideas is as much a part of the tradition often as the good ideas, and we have to sort of sift them. But yes, I think that.
But you're trying to build something similar to what you would say the best ideals of these religions is kind of what you're trying to enact in a more of a structured form than your typical atheist or agnostic, right?
So definitely more of a structured and active way than a traditional atheist or even most humanist communities, which tend not to have this sense of communal responsibility for everyone's welfare. And I think that what we're trying to do is awaken people to their responsibility for each other and their power to make the world
better.
Yes, to make the world the sort of world that everyone actually wants to live in. And I think that that's really what we're trying to do. And so that's kind of how I measure the success of our gatherings. I think like anyone who is a member of a congregational community, sometimes they think some Sundays they hit it out of the park and some they don't really get it. But I feel like we've really succeeded when we have helped our community learn a little bit more about some big question in life, when we've connected them to each other more deeply, and when we've inspired them to live more faithfully to their
Now,
higher
do you think, here's a couple of really, really interesting questions. You guys, you personally sound like that you're sincerely doing that correctly. Like that's really seems to be sincere to me.
Good. Yeah, I mean, I hope it's sincere.
That is organically taking root in the people who come to your church or whatever you're calling it. Do you think that that's being implanted in other people? Do you kind of get what I'm because
are we successful? Like, do we actually achieve what we hope?
It's just weird because what you are describing is what I actually think religion is. It's kind of what religion actually is, minus, you have to believe XYZ PDQ about these particular things. Mm-hmm. What you're describing is what I think religion really truly is.
Yes, yeah. I think it should be like that. I mean, I work alongside many clergy from different religious traditions in my work. I do a lot of interfaith work, including a lot of interfaith activism. And what I find almost invariably, at least with the people I work with, is that the commonality in our approach to the sort of communities that we're trying to build and the sort of world we're trying to create massively outweighs our differences in our beliefs about God or ultimate reality or the afterlife or anything like that.
Or you could just put them aside as unsettled questions. I don't feel any need to convince you about what's his face, Jonah having living in the whale for 3. I don't feel any need to convince you, and I can be agnostic about that question. We can set that aside and just talk about what the commonality is. It's not that our differences aren't there. It's that they're not really important if you're trying to build a community that grows together and include other people, right?
I think that's true to some extent, that often the differences seem to fade away. But I don't even want to say the differences aren't important, because they can be very important. They're important to us individually. They're important to our sense of identity and culture and who we are. And they can sometimes cause rifts and differences. Like sometimes I'm in a coalition with one group of my religious colleagues, and sometimes on a different issue I'm in a coalition with a different group of my religious colleagues, because some of them are not on board with it. So the differences matter, but it's more that, at least the way I put it, I think right and wrong transcend religious conceptions, right? So for me, ethics is actually essentially disconnected from metaphysics, in the sense that it kind of doesn't matter what you believe about God. Right is right and wrong is wrong, and our job is to find it together. And what I feel when I'm working with people of different religions towards a common goal is a sense of shared solidarity, despite our sometimes radical differences in beliefs. It's not that the differences go away. It's that we are actually orienting around something else, which is this.
It's that you transcend the differences to some degree, because you have shared values and shared ethics that are more important than what the differences may be, at least in what you're heading towards. Would that be a way of saying? Is that right?
Yes, I think that's a nice way of putting it.
Now here's another question about Vervaeke. You interviewed Vervaeke. I would see him as like totally very, very on board with this, or very, I mean, this sounds to me like right up his alley. Do you agree with that? Or what did you ask him, and how did that go?
Well, that was, so what we're talking about, for your listeners who might not know who John Vervaeke is. John Vervaeke is a professor, I guess you'd call him a philosopher,
neuroscientist.
Yeah, he's someone who has lots of academic interests and has created this very long series of YouTube videos about everything. It's sort of a course on life, the universe, and everything, really. It became very popular. And I interviewed him with a host of a podcast that I co-host called the Lifefulness Podcast. And you can find that wherever you listen to podcasts. And we discussed a lot of things. That podcast is all about secularizing religious practices so that everyone can take part in them. And we talked to John Vervaeke because he has a lot to say about what he calls the meaning crisis, the sense that contemporary culture is beset by multiple interlinked crises, economic, political, cultural, ecological, but that underneath them is a sense of the loss of shared meaning, or a lack of meaning in people's lives, a sense that we don't know our place in the big story of things.
Right.
And that's
let me just stop you one sec, because shared meaning without religion per se is one of the things that you're actually kind of solving with
we try.
your. Well, that's why I thought him and you would be almost like, it would resonate with him what you're doing, and he would resonate with you. Continue.
Right. No, that's exactly right. He certainly resonated with what we're trying to do, because he appreciates that people do need a story to live by. It's something I sometimes say in my talks, is that it was difficult for me to realize, as someone who's trained as a philosopher, that people don't need a philosophy of life. They need a life story, that they need a narrative to be a part of and to know what role they're playing in the narrative. And that's what Vervaeke thinks that much of contemporary culture is missing, a grand narrative. And he links that to the decline of religious participation, to increasing secularism in wealthy democracies, to the idea that when people are moving away from these sort of ready-made cultural narratives, they don't have anything to turn to
replace it with.
Rootless, right? They're feeling out of place. And so some of them turn to things like extremism, like the increasing political extremism we're seeing, especially in the United States, but all across Europe, so that political ideologies take the place of the religious story. Or they turn to self-help gurus, like, I would say someone like Jordan Peterson, right, who's kind of providing this narrative of how you should live, very, in my view, kind of simplistic narrative about how you should live a good life. And I find that idea very provocative and fascinating. I'm not sure I entirely agree with it, but
the other part that he gets, the other part that he goes into deeply, which I would think you'd have at least some interest in, is that he goes back to the parts that I would skip around his meaning crisis. But when he talked about the transcendent traditions from ancient religious practices like shamanistic traditions and the wisdom traditions, that's something that I would think you're at least interested in, and it seems to be a part and parcel of what you do. That there's
yes.
ancient wisdoms to be derived from these different texts, and the spiritual person in like a tribe was telling the story, but he was kind of the spiritual head of the tribe, and he had wisdom to offer, if that wisdom is just based off of life experience. And then he would tell it in story, and that wisdom traditions have sort of come down they're embedded in religions. But that's the part I would think that you would find the most interesting or fruitful. I don't know how familiar you are with his work, but
I find that part of his work. So this is a really interesting question. I am ambivalent in the true sense of that word about kind of spiritual practices drawn from wisdom traditions. In the sense that I am drawn to them personally, and I find them fascinating, and I want to get stuck into them. This is the theater kid part of me. When I was studying theater, I created participatory theatrical events that were almost like religious rituals, because I was so interested in the roots of theater in religious practice and all that stuff. So I'm super into it. And at the very same time, I am very skeptical of it. I find it's an area that you can so easily slip into kind of quackery and kookiness and
woo and new age.
Yeah, woo, right. And so I have this twin feeling. It's sometimes I feel like two poles of a magnet or something that pull apart from each other, but that one part of me is deeply intrigued by it, and another part of me is very cautious or even repelled by it.
The rational skeptic Sam Harris part of like you have.
Yes, exactly. I've got a Sam Harris on one shoulder, and I've got a
Carl Sagan on the other. Kidding me with this crack pottery? Are you kidding me?
So that's something I've wrestled with all my life. Is this dual sense that I'm fascinated by religion and collective practice and spiritual experience and the transcendent and all that. But I'm also very skeptical of it. I don't want to be fooled. I don't want anyone to tell me something that isn't true and to get one over on me. And one of the things I'm actually working on as I get older, I'll be 40 in like 18 months. Isn't that awful?
So I'm freaking 52. John is a young little rapscallion. I'm a freaking old man. He runs circles around me.
As I kind of grow up a little more, I'm trying to integrate those two parts of myself. I haven't quite figured out how to do that. I think probably Carl Sagan is a good model to hold on to as a skeptical appreciator. But yeah, I find that part of his work both compelling and repelling at the same time.
Well, have you checked out the lectures from, I think it's Sagan's daughter, isn't it? She's been into this. She
wrote a book.
Right. And she shops it around on YouTube. You should check it out. It's very spiritual in the sense we're talking about. It's very similar to the stuff you're saying. She talks about narrative and how important that is. And obviously she's her father's daughter. So she's very like Sam Harris-esque at times too. But it's very similar to some of the stuff you're saying. It's overlaps with some of the things that you've been talking about. I think
yes,
you should check her out. I think
her book, Sasha Sagan's book, is called "For Small Creatures Such as We," which is a quote from Carl Sagan: "Rituals and Reflections for Finding Wonder," and it is a magnificent book. I really love it.
Right. So it's talking about what you're talking about, but skepticism arises in you. So how is she handling it different? Is she not? She seems to be hitting it right. Because you were unreserved. You noticed that you said you were skeptical of John Vervaeke.
No, yeah, I am.
But you were unreserved in your praise for her.
Yeah, that's right.
Because it's Carl Sagan's daughter? Or?
It might be. It might be just because she gets the authority from that lineage that makes me, think, yeah, I can trust this.
This is going to be good.
I think, so I might be overcompensating in my skepticism of things like, wisdom traditions, and I have to be honest, Craig, I hate that term. Because I just think they have some wisdom and they have a lot of nonsense, and it's all mixed together. They're not universally wise. No tradition is universally wise, and so I don't know. I just don't love that term. But I think part of my feeling is that there is a tendency for people to believe and buy into stuff just because it can be given some sort of religious heritage, right? So if you package anything as rediscovered ancient wisdom from whatever religious tradition, people are like, oh yeah, this must be good. And I guess I'm reacting against that by kind of, if many people take an instinctive step forward because of that, I want to take an instinctive step back.
I hear
and be like,
you're almost like an intuitive heretic. I'm actually surprisingly similar. If all of my friends are on board with something, I almost automatically become skeptical and start getting turned off to it. And I'm the same way with a lot of stuff. If it's something that people are automatically drawn to, I'm automatically skeptical of it.
Right,
I get exactly what you're saying.
I almost sometimes, and this is just the contrarian in me. This is my kind of Christopher Hitchens devil on my shoulder, but where if everyone in a room is agreeing with something,
you'll be like, I doubt it.
I doubt it just because of that, even if I actually agree with it. And I know, I really agree with this, but I'm feeling like I disagree with it now because everyone else agrees with it. Right. Yeah, that can't be healthy, and that can't be intellectually respectable.
Normally it's wise. That's why I'm that way, because whenever you find people automatically agreeing with something, they tend to be a little glassy-eyed, and I'm automatically like draw back from it. Even if it's something that I, in principle, agree with, because there's usually some other mechanism at work that you are picking up on. That's my own intuition.
I think that's a nice way of putting it. Yeah, that's a nice way of putting it. I mean, I don't know. I worry about this because it has led me astray. I mean, sometimes it's made me more skeptical than I should be of ideas that are perfectly reasonable.
Legitimate.
And it's let me be. I worry that when I was younger, when I was a teenager, I was into all sorts of stuff, not because I really believed it, because I found it fascinating. So I would read all the books about pyramidology and how the pyramids reflect the stars and how there's secret chambers in them, and Eric von Daniken and the lines of Nazca and how aliens were landing. And I loved ufology and all that stuff.
Right.
And I don't think I ever believed in it, but I was very passionate about it. I really liked it.
That's that's really interesting, because I was the same with astrology. When I was like 14, 15, one of my girlfriends got me into like Linda Goodman's love signs. So I started like devouring it and I didn't quite believe it, but I almost believed it. And I knew everybody in my hometown sign, everyone. I knew, because I asked them at one point or another, what sign are you? And then one night at a party, I tripped everybody out. And I said, I knew astrology is true. I can tell what everybody's sign is just based on your behavior. And everybody had told me their sign and forgotten that they had told me it. And I remembered. So like Dave Novak, Cancer. How did you know? I'm like, it's so obvious that I make up some crap about his personality. Somebody else. And I got everybody's sign, 100 people. I tripped everybody out because they'd forgotten that they told me. And I knew everybody. So that's small town. So every single person at the party had told me at one point or another, and I remembered absolutely everybody's sign. So I same idea. Like you don't really believe it, but you're fascinated by it, and then you kind of half believe it. And I'm not even sure what I felt about it.
I think I'm susceptible to that stuff. I think that part of my skepticism is because I know that I'm susceptible to it. One of the reasons I think I am so allergic to anything that looks like a cult, like I'm very proud that I was personally responsible for evicting Scientologists from Harvard Square, because basically they would hand out their stuff outside a quite famous newsstand right in Harvard Yard. And one time I went into them and I said, do you know anything about Scientology? And you're allowing them to use the space? And they said, yeah. They asked them. We said, yes, you can set up and give your stuff. And I said, would you mind if I bring in some articles about what they believe and how the organization operates? And I did. And then they stopped them using the space.
Wow.
I was very proud of that. And I hate cults, right? I hate them with a passion. I intensely dislike them. And I think one of the reasons is because they control people's minds, because they overthrow the rational faculty that is so important to me. But also, I suspect I might hate them because I know that I'm susceptible to it, that I am the sort of person who can be swayed by, I'm very emotional and I get swept up in things. And I know that about myself. And I think on some level, it's like a defense mechanism to keep this stuff at arm's length. But now, as I say, as I kind of get a bit older, I worry that it's preventing me from having that kind of open-minded passion for things that I used to be passionate about as a kid. Maybe I'm overly skeptical. That
in terms of an atheist, I mean, you consider yourself an atheist, right?
Yes, I definitely am.
In terms of an atheist, you're not even close to overly skeptical. You're way on the spectrum of like, there are atheists who you can't even talk about this stuff without them like foaming at the mouth and like going like.
I have met such people. I mean, there's sometimes good reasons for it. I mean, it goes back a bit to what I said right at the start about, one of the things I think people often forget when they talk about religion in the abstract is how culturally and politically powerful it is. And because of that, I think a lot of people, including a lot of the members of the Ethical Society, have had really terrible experiences with religion, and so they are sort of allergic to it.
But your description,
but I'm not like that, right? I'm not
your description of transcendence was perfectly normal. How you describe transcendent experiences, that's what I would expect most agnostics or atheists to say. But a lot of them won't even say it in reasonable, humanistic, naturalistic terms like you did.
One of my goals has been within the humanist community itself, within the sort of atheist movement such as it is to try to open people's minds a little bit to facets of experience that they may have closed off for themselves, because of whatever bad experience they have with religion, or because of how they think about religion. And what I try and tell people is, it reminds me of a colleague of mine who recently died, actually, but he was an employee of the Center for Inquiry, which is a big national humanist organization, secular humanist campaigning organization. And he worked there, and he was very, very skeptical of anything that smelled like religion, including group singing. He said that secular people should not sing in groups because that is what religious people do, and we are not religious, so we shouldn't do that. And we once had, a series of kind of a running battle in the blogs where we wrote dueling articles about our different points of view. And what I tried to argue, and what I continue to try and argue within my movement, is group singing is not a religious thing. It is a human thing that religions use. And to cut yourself off from that positive, for many people, human experience because religions use it is to allow religion to encroach upon so many aspects of human life which are not properly religious. And so I would say all the experiences that are now associated with religion, like group singing or ecstatic experience or ritual, they all predate religion. They are all human things that became associated with religion over time. And part of the task now, and this is a very John Vervaeke thing to say, but part of the task now is to disentangle them from the religious structures that have sort of monopolized them for so long and say, no, you can have that too. You just don't have to believe the beliefs. Craig, this has been fascinating. I'm sorry. I don't know, how long are we going for? Because I have a husband waiting for me. I have to write a wedding ceremony. I've got tons of stuff to do.
Oh, that's fine. I was just letting it go because I was actually enjoying this. But
no, I'm loving it. I just have to be disciplined because otherwise I will never stop. Like, we will be here way past midnight, and then I'll be like, oh no, I didn't take the dog out. I didn't do anything.
So we can go to questions and just we'll wrap.
Oh, great, questions!
15,
yes, let's do
15 or 20 minutes or so.
Yeah, if anyone has any questions, you're welcome to put it into the chat. So far, we've had quite a few people stopping by to watch the show. Yeah, so you've been a great guest so far, James. Thanks so much for coming on our amazing.
Channel.
Thank you. This is so much fun.
Yeah, this was great.
Let's see. We've got Ron Potts. He was coming in. Scott, of course, he was here. We've got Kafai, who's I think he's a perennialist. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I know Kafi. Yes.
Yeah. Then Shannon Q, she came by. Shannon Q's great.
Yes, it is a tribble. That's true. It's not trouble with truffles, although that does sound like me whenever anyone opens a box of them.
Yeah, that's a Star Trek parody, I'm sure, where like somebody gets a subscription to some sort of like truffle service that just keeps on and they can never like cancel it.
That's a classic episode where they start out fluffy and then they almost destroy the entire Enterprise because they can't get rid of them. I just remember the shell of the story.
Yeah. Anyway, I don't think we have any questions really. A lot of people were just encapsulated with your story and being able to get a better understanding of like, I don't know, it's really cool. You guys getting to sort of like go over all these topics that are very important for us, not just as like quasi-religious people, but as humans, which is very important.
This is something that always happens, John. I always pre-answer all the questions because I never stop talking. So eventually I answer any question anyone could think of asking before they can ask it.
So what is your podcast? Is your podcast on YouTube or is it just...
It's not on YouTube currently. You can get it on iTunes. You can get it on Spotify. You can get it all over the place. It is called the Lifefulness Podcast. The host is Sanderson Jones. Sanderson might be a really fascinating person to talk to if he's very busy, but he created something called the Sunday Assembly, which is a network of non-religious congregations that began in London, England, and then spread across the world. It was quite a big deal initially. They thought no one would come, and they had hundreds of people at the first one, and then it spread very rapidly. He is a huge personality and someone who really speaks about this stuff very well. And we together interview people who are sort of in the secular community building, meaning making space that includes kind of more philosophical thinkers like John Vervaeke, but includes people who are doing really practical things like the person who created Morning Gloryville, which was a series of early morning raves where people would go to this rave, this major kind of dance party really early in the morning before work, and they built a whole community about that. Person who
do they
came up
X
with
when they do it? Are they Xing when they do it, or are they just
what
they're not taking ecstasy?
Oh, I see. You're much cooler than I am. I didn't even know what Xing meant. I'm so pathetic in that way.
Well, back in the day, I actually did. I never went to raves, but I knew all the because I used to hang out in the East Village all the time. The raves used to be like
sober, no alcohol, no drugs.
Oh, okay. Because the rave used to be you take ecstasy and like there were these warehouses that they transform into these like 17-hour dance parties of like people basically on ecstasy for 4 or 5 straight hours. That's what originally they were back in the 90s. I have no idea.
It's called the wellness rave, and you do it in the morning, and it is totally sober.
Okay.
And it involves, music.
Yeah, if you have to go to work afterwards, it might not be a good idea to take ecstasy.
That can be a bit of a challenge. But it's someone also who created this grief processing experience for adults, where you get basically assigned to a dinner party of people in your local area, and you go and eat together and talk about your recent bereavement, or however long it's been, and so people who create communities around shared experiences are particularly interesting to us. We've had some fascinating guests. We spoke to Tim Minchin, the musician.
Oh, nice. He's hilarious.
And he was wonderful. We talked about his views about religion and spirituality in a way that he said he had never spoken to anyone in public before. So it was a great interview. So yeah, check out the Lifefulness podcast. We just did our 1-year review show. We recorded it today. We've done 62 episodes over just over a year, and we're very proud of it. So
cool.
Take a look.
So who are some of the other guests that you were that people would be the most interested in?
We spoke to one of my favorites that really sticks out to me we spoke to a British philosopher called Jules Evans, and Jules Evans spoke to us about conspirituality. We spoke to him not too long after the storming of the Capitol, and he had written a viral Medium post about the links between conspiracy thinking and New Age spirituality, and how there was actually a kind of weird network connecting people from New Age spirituality circles into this far/alt-right kind of media ecosystem, and how they fed off each other and promoted each other, and why might there be any kind of philosophical connection between what is essentially a form of neo-fascism and this, what some people think of as very hippie-ish, which is the kind of spirituality and wellness kind of segment. And he explained those connections so well that it really helped me understand what had happened. And it's always good when you speak to a guest who can help you understand a major cultural event like that in a new way. So I really loved that episode with Jules Evans.
That's interesting.
All right, so we got some questions. We'll try to go through them and then let you get back to. Okay, so I'll go in reverse order. Here's one from Scott. Regarding the supreme ethical maxim, how do we determine what is best in others as to know if we are properly satisfying the maxim or not?
So there is Felix Adler, the guy who wrote the maxims, story about this, and then there's my story about this. He meant something very particular, which is not what people immediately think. He once said, I'm trying to remember the exact quote, but he said he wasn't, when he said bring out the best in others, he didn't mean their empirical best. He meant their spiritual best. And I'm never sure what he meant by that. He had a very unusual philosophy. It was a form of Kantian idealism, and it's very difficult to read and understand for people with a contemporary mindset, even though he wasn't that long ago. 140 years is not very long ago in philosophy, but it's just a different way of thinking about things that is quite difficult to access. So it's a little bit difficult to explain what he meant. but one of the ways we can get to the heart of it, I think, is that he made a distinction between what he called people's value and their worth. And he said a person's value is kind of what good they are to you or to society, like how much they contribute. And he says there are some people he knows he can't think of them having much value. He struggles to find any value in them. But he says we all have equal worth.
The worth
and that
is innate.
A different thing, right? It's an innate property of people as members of what he thought of as a spiritual community, by which he didn't really mean ghostly spirits. He meant an idealized human community. And in the idealized human community, people were of equal worth. And so we should treat them that way to bring us closer to that ideal, regardless of how they actually acted and behaved. So it wasn't really that he wanted to bring out the best in terms of their best behavior, although I think he thought that would surely follow from what he wanted to do. It was more about awakening them to their potential to be more than they are. And by doing that, they would act in a better way by default. So it was a more nuanced idea than we sometimes treat it in our community. Scott's a member of the Ethical Society of St. Louis, so we can talk about this all day. But yeah, I mean, I tend to use that maxim in a more down-to-earth way, basically meaning, be your best self and try and help others be their best self. But I must admit, I'm not good at it. Like, I do notice that everyone says that preachers always preach the sermon they themselves need to hear. And that's definitely true with me. Like I act in many ways that don't bring out the best in the people closest to me. So it's always a good reminder to me to think about that maxim and how much it asks of you. It's a very active, high ask maxim, and I do like that.
All right. Now you're welcome to answer this if you wish, or not. You can refrain. That's perfectly fine.
What's the punishment for not bringing it out in somebody?
Okay, so yeah, if you've had any experience with psychedelics, and if you rather not answer that, just if you're familiar with Terence McKenna's apparent, I guess, heroic dose.
I was interested in. I have no problem answering this question at all. Right. I've never taken any psychedelic substances because I'm boring in that way. In fact, when I was younger, I didn't drink at all until I was 34 years old.
See, James, so I was giving you an out. You didn't have to admit this.
No, I'm totally. I actually was really. It became a thing for me when I kind of decided when I was a teenager I wasn't going to drink or do drugs at all, and part of it was I had the sense that. How can I put it? I was an outgoing person, but I was also quite insecure in some ways. And I actually wanted to learn how to interact with people without that help, I wanted to learn how to have a good time at a party and dance without being drunk.
Yeah.
And so I decided never to do that. And then when I turned 34, I was like, well, I'll give it a try. I was on vacation and there was a swim up bar and they were selling hurricanes. And I was like, that looks fun. And I was like, yeah, this is actually really fun. What have I been missing? But by
4 days later, you're like,
choice.
Wake up. And
right. It was a miracle I made it home. But what I haven't done is psychedelics like mushrooms, LSD, or anything like that. I am interested in that, and there are lots of books and articles about that coming out now as a kind of reappreciation of psychedelics, and I would be totally open to exploring that with it. Yes, I was straight edge. I read about it in a magazine when I was a kid. How terribly nerdy is that? That's just the worst. But yeah, I haven't done psychedelics, but I would. I if I found the right environment, I think I would try it. Yes.
Yeah. All right. So I'm not sure if you're familiar at all with Tom Holland.
I am.
Yeah, he has this book, Dominion. I don't know, Craig, you might know more about it than I do. But what are your sort of thoughts on Tom Holland's sort of work, James?
So the basic thesis, as I understand it, I have not read his book, but I have heard him on podcasts and YouTube videos speak about the book. There's a couple of podcasts I listen to regularly that he was a guest on, and I've heard him explain his thesis, which, as I understand it, and I'm not going to do it justice, is basically that it charts the influence that he thinks Christianity has had on culture through obviously 2,000 plus years. And the thesis is basically that were it not for Christianity, our culture would look very different than it does today,
ethically,
and particularly our moral and ethical culture. That there was a very distinctive Christian character to the moral culture that we have today, and
that's actually a very good summation of it. So that's fair.
I do try and listen to these people. Well, what do I think about it? I mean, I'm hesitant to give like a judgment without reading the argument in the book. My instinct is he is a very learned person who I could learn a huge amount from about history. I'm not a historian by academic training, and I would like to read that book. My suspicion is, because this is not a new argument in the sense that many people have made the argument throughout history that Christianity is distinctively responsible for the moral culture of our age, that maybe there's an underappreciation of secular sources of those same moral values and an understatement of the ways in which, like, Christianity is a very diverse tradition. There isn't a single set of Christian ethics, and all through history, Christians have fought, sometimes literally, with each other about what the right ethics are. And so I suspect that I would read it and think, this is an insufficiently nuanced take if we really want to dig down. But I hesitate to. I'm looking at it now.
What's interesting,
the audio book.
What's interesting is your description of the difference between the innate worth of the human being versus the value of the human being. You don't see that as Christian, but when you said it, I think that is so Christian. Like, that what you have done to the least of my children, you have done to me. Like, that's what I think of as Christian. But the ethical thing that you were talking about, the framework of your secular ethics, made complete sense to me. But I see it as very similar to a Christian idea of, like, the human being has intrinsic worth, and the society only sees the value of the human being. Like, what can they do for me, and what are they worth according to society? Are they rich? Can they help me? Can they hook me up? Whereas you're talking about the intrinsic worth of the human being is there. I see that as Christian. I see this very similar to Christianity. I don't know if you do, but it's the same. I'm on the same ethical page as you, let's just say.
I think there's certainly elements of the Christian tradition that are very similar to that. And I think there are also elements of the Christian tradition that are actually not that similar to that. And I think that that's the real complexity when you talk about the influence of Christianity. It's like, what Christianity are you talking about?
Right.
And I also think I have a particular appreciation for the Renaissance humanists, who were, of course, Christian by and large, trying to reform the Christian tradition by drawing on classical sources. And I partly like them because many of them were British, and they shaped British culture for majorly, partly because one of them founded the high school I went to, and that tradition is still very much part of how it teaches and what it teaches, with ancient Greek and Latin and going back to the classics. But it is important to remember that when Christian theologians and philosophers and statespeople and stuff like that were very, very influential, for instance, across Europe during the Renaissance, they were drawing explicitly on pre-Christian pagan sources for a lot of their moral and cultural teachings. They were drawing on Plutarch and Cicero and Socrates and Plato, who were being rediscovered and reinterpreted. Right. Exactly.
Platonic forms, and totally.
And Platonic ideas are inseparable from the history of particularly Catholic Christian thought.
Yeah,
and
totally.
So when you say Christianity has been very influential in modern Western culture, but pre-Christian thinkers were very influential on them. Right. So who gets the credit ultimately for this? I think that's an interesting question.
Yeah, that's a fair point, because like Aristotle, there's like during the medieval ages, there was a revival of Aristotelian philosophy, not only within Christianity but also within Muslim faith, and also within Judaism.
Yes.
Three very, and like Thomas Aquinas, of course, being a very significant Catholic thinker, drawing most of his writing, most of his sort of philosophical backing from Aristotle. But yeah,
right.
Aristotle
and
is
you
certainly
could, and
not
you
a
could
Christian.
say, Aristotle definitely not a Christian. Yes, we all agree on that, hopefully. But you can definitely say, and I've heard, Tom Holland say that there were elements of pre-Christian societies like ancient Greece, ancient Rome, before Christian Rome, which were very horrific, right? Which engaged in ethical practices which we would today entirely reject, and I totally agree with that. And at the same time, there were elements of medieval Christian society that were also very horrific, and horrific in very, very similar ways. They literally, I was just reading Hilary Mantel's book, Wolf Hall, which is just a wonderful book and set right in the heart of Renaissance Christianity in the West. And they burned each other for believing the wrong kind of Christianity. So I think,
and you're saying that's bad.
Tell the whole picture. I think it's bad. I mean,
okay.
I thought I don't know.
No, I'm just making sure you're saying that that's wrong. I got you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay,
all
we
right.
can.
John and I were like, they
question.
did awesome.
Yeah, last question, and then we'll let you go. Okay.
Yes. All right.
All right. What is James' view of worship and whether it is valuable?
Oh, that's a lovely question. I have a colleague, another ethical culture leader, which is the honorific title for clergy in our movement, which is very pompous, but that's what it is, who reminds people that worship, it etymologically comes from, it means worthship. It is finding the worth in things. And so I don't use that word myself much. I'm quite secular in my language and terminology, since I don't use the word prayer, or I don't use the word God metaphorically. And I tend not to say that I worship things except in an ironic way, like, I worship that Beyonce outfit or something. But if I do think about the term, I do like this sense of worthship, finding what is of value in things, and that is, this is something I think I get from my parents, the sense that the world is filled with wonderful things to know and learn, and that we can have an outlook that is open to all those things and can find the worth in lots of different things. I really appreciate my parents for being generally not at all snobbish in where they found pleasure and where they found value. And so I think, if I think of worship as an attitude towards the world in which we're oriented towards finding what is of worth in whatever we encounter, that I kind of like that.
That's great.
That's cool.
All right, Craig, you want to play us off?
We're wrapping it up. Well, why don't you sign us off? Tell us whatever you want to leave us with, where to find you, how we join, how much money it costs for us to participate. So I usually hit people up for money at this point, but you can play it however you want.
People can send me money anytime they want. I've just moved house, so
we have a very similar attitude.
But so if you want to find more about the congregation I serve, the Ethical Society of St. Louis, it's ethicalstl.org. That's ethicalstl.org. And you can actually join all our gatherings online. And how much does it cost to participate? $0. You can join in almost everything we do without paying any money whatsoever. And you can become a member of the community if you want to without paying any money whatsoever. We have no minimum pledge. We just ask you that you sign in a pledge form, but it can say nothing on it.
And so what's your online, like how many people are online? Like 200 or so, 300?
Well, right now it's weird because we're in person and online, and we've only done it twice. So I don't have a big sample size for you, but I would say last Sunday, I think we had about 120 people in person and about 50, 60 people online. I think I might be making that up, but I think we're between 150 and 200 total, I think. But you can join. We use a platform called Alter to host all our online events, and it's really cool. It's actually a really fun new platform, much better than Zoom. You get to hang out with your friends and watch it like you're at the movies together. It's really cool. And we do that every Sunday morning at 10 a.m. Central Time. And then if you want to find me and you want to find more about my work, you can go to croftspeaks.org. That's my second name, speaks.org. You can find a very brooding photo of me. And there's a link there on the front page to subscribe to my Substack. Again, I don't charge money for that. You can't even pay me money. There's not even a money option. I write very infrequently, but I do occasionally write my thoughts about life, the universe, and everything, and what's happening in St. Louis or whatever is on my mind. So go there and sign up. And if you do that, you may be one of the first to hear about a new project that I might be involved in that I can't say anything about, but would be exciting. If you like this conversation,
so he throws a little teaser out there.
Yeah, you should really sign up to that Substack, because
you'll find out.
Hopefully be announcing something soon. That would be cool.
Sounds great.
You'll find out secret stuff that only you will know.
Exactly. The secret truth about reality will be revealed via my Substack.
So with that, we will sign it off. This was a phenomenal conversation, and actually, I would love to have what's your partner's name? The guy you
Sanderson Jones.
Yeah,
he's a larger than life human. I'll tell him.
Yeah, well, I'd love to have him on the show. That'd be great. He's similar to you, I take it, or along the same lines?
We are very simpatico in terms of our fundamental kind of approach to things. He has a different emotional tone. He's much more exuberant, and he's a former stand-up comedian, and he is very, very funny. Yeah, I like to say that some people think that I am the smart one and he's the funny one, but honestly, that's not fair, because I can be quite funny too.
People think
he's
that
great.
about
No,
me.
He's great. He's very smart. Folks, this has been a pleasure. I really do have to go. I've got some work to do, so it's lovely to meet you.
Yeah, you too. Thank you for stopping by. And with that, we will close her down for the night.